morning. I would like to call to order the SDCERS Board of Administration meeting for Friday, July 10th, 2015. Cynthia, do we have a quorum?
Yes, we have a quorum.
Thank you. We have two speakers on the non-agenda public comment. First, Mr. Tony Khalil.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Tony Khalil. I'm a 27-year city employee, and by the time I retire, I'll be 30 years with the city. I'm just here to request that the board maybe direct staff to review the Brown formula calculations. You may have heard it many, many times before, and that deals with divorce. When you divorce, in my case, for example, 20 years ago, and by the time I retire, I would have had 30 years, the calculations under the Brown formula for the former spouse benefits are based on my current salary, which would have been doubled since my divorce. And I've talked to a couple of attorneys. There are many, many city employees who are in the same predicament. And they believe that the attorney's advice is make it a class action so it's beneficial to everybody. My point is it shouldn't be a class action against the board. We are members of the board. We contribute to the board or to our retirement plan. And I know maybe staff can revise or review the calculations or the way it's made within the confines of the law, but that would benefit the members who contribute to the plan. There are many employees. This was impromptu. I was here yesterday at the board, and they told me that the meeting is today, so I took advantage of it. But I know at least 14 employees that I've spoken with who are in the same predicament, who don't believe that the distribution to the former spouse after 15, 20, 25 years of the divorce should be based on the benefits or your salary at the time of retirement. Rather, it should be based on the time of your legal separation, whatever that amount was. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Next, Mr. Joe Flynn.
Good morning, President Trosser, members of the board. My name is Joe Flynn, and my shirt may have given me away. I am a retiree. President Trosser mentioned this morning that he thought that I had abandoned you. Not so. But with the additional video coverage, we're able to save travel time and also keep up with the B&G committee and with the board, and that has been very helpful to many retirees. Many have travel difficulties, and they are still able to keep up on the retirement system. So we are really looking forward to the high def that's in the future. We hope that will be coming along soon. The only disadvantage with the video is that it's not interactive, and that we cannot thank you for your service and your time here. So we have to come down now and then to do that, and I do thank all of you for your time, your experience, and your efforts on our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I see Mark Hovey in the queue.
Yes, you all know that former trustee Dick Tart last was at a board meeting, I think in November, and then he was unable to make the last few meetings before he rolled off his term. So we had an evening social a few months ago in which we thanked him after hours, and I was hoping that he could come this morning so we could publicly thank Dick for his 6 years of service to the board, and he was unable to come. So he very much appreciates the invitation. Again, thoroughly enjoyed the social hour and really enjoyed working with all of you. You may know that Dick has since been appointed to serve on the San Diego County Pension Board. He's had his first meeting over there. I talked with him yesterday. It was his birthday, by the way. And he's doing well. So, again, he just wanted to say thank you for his service. We do have a plaque that a lot of you signed, or all of you signed. And he said make sure it's sent in some very good bubble wrap to me, and I'll be sure to display it prominently at home. So just wanted to relay that from Dick.
Cool. Thank you. We'll certainly miss Dick and certainly miss his jokes. With that, moving on, I would like to ask for approval of consent agenda items A through D. It's been moved by James Steele, seconded by Carol Broad.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And motion passes 11-0. Next, under business operations, is election of the SDCERS Board President. My 2-year term expires actually as of the end of last meeting. And with this, I will turn it over to the chair of the committee looking at this, Dick Wilkin.
Thank you, Ed, and on behalf of the committee, and I'm sure all members of the board, we want to thank you for 2 great years as your service as president. You've done a great job, and we really appreciate it. The other members of the nominating committee beside myself are Bill Hayner, Jimmy Steele, Thanasi Prevolos, and Tom Sullivan. The committee met on May 27th, had a good extensive meeting, thorough discussions. The committee nominates our vice president as president, Alan Ariato. At this point, are there any other nominations from the floor? Hearing none, I would ask that we, in lieu of voting by paper, have a motion to approve, to elect Alan as our next president. If we could get the motion up. I will make the motion.
Ready to vote?
One speaker in the queue.
Try to anyway.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
May I?
Yes.
Really quick, before the vote happens, and Alan, we've talked about this before, I'm going to be voting no on this issue. I want to make sure I explain that because I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea about this. Number one, I think that you're extremely well qualified. I think you have great experience. I think that you've certainly earned the right to be the president. If anybody has earned the right to be the president, you certainly have. The only issue that I have is your position with the union. And I think that it's our obligation to avoid conflicts of interest, including potential conflicts. And while I don't doubt that you have the ability to recognize when a potential conflict would occur and excuse yourself or recuse yourself, I think the issue is we owe it as fiduciaries to avoid that potentiality, and especially when it's our president that has to potentially excuse himself. So I want to be very clear that I'm voting based on my conscience and my responsibility as a fiduciary, not in any way, shape, or form should it be considered a reflection on your ability, my respect for you, and my friendship with you. So, okay, thank you.
Are there other comments from the members? If not, let's vote.
All votes are in.
And motion passes 10-0.
Congratulations, Alan.
Congratulations.
May I correct the record? The motion passed actually 10-1, not 10-0.
Oh, sorry. Mr. President.
Oh, all right. Do I move in that chair now, too? I'll stay in this chair. I don't think the chairs feel any different.
This is a reminder to the board, at the next meeting in September, Alan will be then appointing as vice chair.
Vice President.
Vice President.
Correct. So, and then also committee assignments. Also, we'll be reviewing that. So I just wanted to thank the board, thank Ed. Thanasi, I completely understand. It's not something I haven't heard before or dealt with before. So I know there's a lot of concern about having a union president and a pension president be the same person. Over the years, as I've sat here, moved around the dais, actually, this is the first time I've actually sat on this side for the most part. But you learn so much watching past presidents and how they conduct themselves, and in learning from Elaine and staff on the art really of disclosure and recusal. And that's really the key, really not for just me as a president, for all of us, on anything that could be a potential conflict. So, but with that said, I really appreciate the board's confidence to be able to put me in this seat wearing those, having those two hats. Never wear both hats at the same time. So thank you. So, with that, anything, Ed, as outgoing president?
I guess I would just like to say 2 years ago I was very honored to be elected president. It's been a privilege serving as president. I've learned a lot. I think I've grown a lot. And I have full faith and confidence that Alan's going to pick up from where I left off. The president before me, Herb Morgan, he said one thing that I've never forgotten. He pledged when he became president that he was going to make pensions boring again. And hopefully I was able to uphold that. We've managed to stay out of the newspapers in any negative light. We had a couple of positive comments. Unfortunately, it was when they were talking about the county. But in any event, we stayed out of the paper. I think we were boring. And Alan, see if you could be a boring president.
That's the goal. That's the goal. And our friends over at the county are helping us out a little bit, taking some of the heat. So I think pensions is one of those things that really, as hard as it was for all those years, it ultimately became a good thing, because I think for decades, not many people really understood how the system worked. And now people do, and people are paying attention. And that's a good thing from all aspects. So with that, move down the agenda. Audit Committee. David Kramer? Lee?
Good morning, everyone. I can
Morning.
say good morning, Mr. President, for the first time. The most recent audit committee meeting was held Wednesday, July 8, 2 days ago. There was one action item at the meeting, probably the most important action item. Lee Paravano presented his internal audit plan for the coming fiscal year. This is what shapes his activities daily. He also presented the risk assessment that was conducted for audit planning purposes to help identify high-risk activities to consider in his audit plan. There are 8 audit activities planned for the fiscal year and 3 contingent audits to be initiated if the other ones are completed. Among the 8 planned, there are 2 I think you should be aware of. One is audits, 2 plan sponsor audits, the airport and the port. You'll recall that Lee originally was asked to audit all 3, the plan sponsor contributions for the city, for the airport, and the port, one after the other, beginning in October 2013 and ending in February of this year. It was the first time ever, so the 3 were audited in rapid succession. These audits resulted in significant improvements in the processes of these sponsors and thus of the accuracy at SDCERS. Now the schedule calls for him to re-audit one of those each year. But because the initial 3 took longer than expected, he'll need to re-audit 2 this year to catch up. The good news is that they're expected to take about half the time of the original audits, now that he knows what's happening and there are perhaps some of the more difficult things out of the way. The other notable activity in the audit plan this year is the audit of the retirement benefits calculations and setup here at SDCERS. That's a significant activity for SDCERS. This audit was begun last year, and as a first-time effort, is taking longer than expected. It was originally planned for 380 hours and now is expected to take over 500. In fact, as an extra measure of diligence, Lee has added 50% more elements to the plan for the audit this year, for this particular audit, than he had originally included. I want to assure you that the extra time taken in these audits is not due to slow activity on Lee's part. Rather, it's the result of 2 things: first-time audits of very complex areas, and due care taken in the process. SDCERS management and the audit committee are satisfied that the internal auditor is examining at an appropriate level and is discovering very helpful information. The audit committee voted unanimously 4-0 to approve this audit plan, and I will pause here for any questions and to let you vote.
Thank you, David. Any questions or comments from board?
I do have a question.
Dick?
I had sent a question earlier, so you're aware of it. My interest is in what's involved in your plan under that category of benefit calculations and setup. Tell us a little bit about what you're actually doing in that category.
So for this activity, I originally thought of it as two separate activities. Either I could look at all retirement benefit payments occurring now and into the future, or look at all benefit payments that have happened and then going forward. So I looked at the whole population of benefits. Anybody getting paid as of March 31st, 2015 was eligible to be sampled. So that was the first element. So I looked at all past payees and all current payees. They were all available to be sampled. And then what I did is I met with Elaine and with Marcel and said, tell me all the areas that we've had prior issues or corrections, and tell me any areas where you think there could be possible future corrections or any issues that may need my efforts. So I sat down with both of them. We came up with a list of additional things rather than just plain throwing darts at the board, and said, these are the areas I think you should focus on, Lee. So we came up with there's about 15 to 18 other things rather than just random sampling, and looking at those individually and in depth to come up with an opinion as to whether or not the retirement benefit calculations are properly set up. I can give you an example of some of them if you want.
The looking back aspects, that's a sampling in order to come up with categories of where you need to focus your future efforts?
No, so what it is that I looked at all benefit whenever the benefit was effective. So I'm looking at benefits that were effectively set up back in 1975, 1982, 1988, 1995, 2010, rather than looking at all some retirement systems will look at retirement benefits that are effective this current year and moving forward. So they're looking at the current process of how the benefits were set up. I'm looking at the entire population of not taking the date of when the benefit was effective, saying how did past administrations set up that benefit and whether or not that was appropriate.
What's the purpose of looking back and looking at sampling back?
Because, as you know, if you make a small dollar error in the past, say it'd be $5 a month in a benefit payment that was set up 15 years ago, when that compounds, you can get over the $100 threshold that's required to correct very quickly. So I wanted to make sure that I've got the entire population of all members to make sure that the retirement benefit was appropriately set up. The last thing I wanted to do, I didn't want to look at only current retiree benefits that were set up and only look at that population, because I would be neglecting to look at all the other benefits that we're currently paying and only look at the ones that we're doing right now.
Well, we have thousands of benefits from the past. Are you looking at every one of them?
No, just a random sampling of all the benefit payments. So if we have 9,000 current payees, you throw the darts at the board, just take a random sampling and say, okay, I'm going to select this one, this one, this one, and this one. Say it'd be 25 or 40 of those, and perform an in-depth sampling of looking at each one of those. What are the components of their retirement benefit? They have a base retirement benefit. They're receiving a cost of living annuity. They're receiving a surviving spouse annuity. So are all those components correctly set up when we originally did it?
And then what do you do with that information?
Just what I would do is, if they were all set up correctly, for my work paper, I would check it off and say this one was appropriately set up, and go through the 25 and say, okay, we got the 25 that are correctly set up or not correctly set up, and then set those aside and then say, okay, what are the areas that I met with Elaine and Marcel on, and say, are these areas properly set up? Select a sampling of those individual members. And then once that's all done, come back to the board and report that based on my testing, this is what I found.
My concern has been something this board's been struggling with for 2 years now, which is that we find ourselves looking back over a period of many years, discovering issues in benefit calculations over 10, 15 longer years, and then turning around and under our fiduciary responsibilities having to collect from retirees thousands of dollars in which they had no part in those mistakes. I'm struggling a little bit in terms of what you do when you look back and you do your audit with what you then do, because it seems to me that we, to be fair to our retirees, need to make sure that we don't make mistakes on a going forward basis so that we're not in this situation where we're trying to, I would say, unfairly correct, including once you include the interest that we have to charge people. And would hope that we would come up with a process, and this is a question too, where we could be assured on a going forward basis that we have sufficient quality controls and or a case-by-case audit going forward that within, say, 3 years of somebody retiring, they can be assured that they're good to go. That there is just, I know you can't guarantee 100% because we get information from other agencies sometimes and so forth, but that's my concern. So I guess my question to you is how can we address what I think is the real importance here, which is to sample past experience to be able to develop better controls going forward.
Yeah, so I think I completely understand. Some other retirement systems, what they'll do is they'll test a sampling of current retiree benefit setups every single year. Some of them will do it every other year or every third year. So that's something that I could add to my audit plan. Maybe not every single year, but every other year or every third year. Look at sampling of all the member benefit payments set up in that year or the past 3 years and say, are those ones correct? But the reason that I really want to look back is if we do have an error in a benefit calculation that was set up 5 years ago, hopefully the testing that I'm doing now will catch some of these errors rather than letting it go another 5 or 10 years before we catch it. So I'm casting a very wide net to say, is there any potential issues that I could see or possibly see that staff or management should look into? And if there is any, we should look into those now rather than letting the interest in additional payments accrue.
Keep in mind, too, that when he finds a particular error on a particular, if he does, for a particular setup, it's not just for that person, it's a type of error. And then we're going to discover that perhaps that type error was made for a number of people. So the possibility of finding a type of error rather than a specific individual gives him greater assurance that he's catching a broader sampling.
That's still, to me, the problem that I see that is that you're now talking about potentially correcting thousands of past setups and calculations, when it seems to me more productive and a fairer thing to be focusing on future accuracy so we avoid these.
I did when I set this audit up, I met with most of the staff that are in charge of setting up any benefit calculations. So I was looking at the current process of how they're setting up benefit calculations currently. So I didn't exclude how we're currently doing it. So that is going to be in my report, how we are currently doing it, if there's any improvements that we can make. But the same steps would happen whether or not I chose all current retiree benefit payments or the wide net. I was still going to sit with everyone and say, how do you do your job? What's the process that you go through? What are the quality control reviews that you go through to make sure that we accurately set up this person's benefit? On a go-forward basis, I can include it in next year's audit plan, or we can amend this year's audit plan to look at only current year setups to look at their benefit payments. And that is something that we can do. I mean, it is the discretion of the board to look at my activities and alter them.
Well, I'd like to hear from other board members, but it just seems to me that if what we're doing is just trying to mushroom this past activity, it's going to result in some unfair issues going, for in the past. And I think it would be more productive to focus on controls going forward.
Yeah, I can assure you that the purpose of the audit is not to try to mushroom any possible corrections. It's to, if there is any possible errors out there, to stop them immediately, and so that we don't further have any problems.
Thank you.
Bill?
This is a concern to me also, has been since I've been on the board now 4 years, is that we have many retirees coming in saying that they've had errors and we've identified the errors, and then they have to pay it back, and they don't know about it in many cases. So I had a couple questions. One is, how do you determine the appropriate sample size statistically to be valid? And have you looked at other plans and talked to other plan administrators about how they would approach the sample size from a statistical point of view?
So to answer your first question about what the current sample size is, it's based on a sampling model that's used by a lot of external and internal auditors, just looking at just a random sampling about how many should I select. But I think talking to management and to staff, looking not only just the random sample, what are the areas that we could possibly have problems? I think that's a real area of focus. I just don't want to just throw the net out there and just try to look at random sampling. I want to look at areas where management has identified there could be a potential problem or a potential issue where I could add some value to the process that's being undertaken. So I have reached out to other systems. I have talked to Orange County is one of them that actually performs random samplings each year or every other year to look at the current retiree benefit payment setups. They may select a larger sample size. I don't think that if I select a larger sample size, it's going to result in any different outcome.
How big was our sample size?
The current sample size is 25 of just a pure random sampling, but in addition to that, I've looked at 60 other member benefit payments in specific target areas that I think that there could have been or could be an issue. So in certain areas, the big random net is 25, but in certain situations, I'm looking at specific benefit components, and that sample size is much larger.
So what's the total universe that you're picking the 25 from?
Total universe is any payee that's being paid currently as of March 31st, 2015. Anybody that's on a roll.
And that's pretty big.
Yes.
25 seems pretty small to me for a valid sample size.
I can see your concern there, but I can assure you that the sample size is not just 25. There is 25 just individuals, but then looking at each individual component. Let's just pick one component. Say it's the cost of living adjustment. So that sample size is about 85. So there's a much bigger sample size when you look at each component of the retirement benefit setup. So there is a larger sample size. I can certainly increase my sample size. It will increase the time it takes me to finish my audit, but that's at the discretion of the board as well.
How long does it take to do one case? So for instance, if you've got 25, how long would one case take?
As you alluded to earlier, some of the benefits are very complicated in how they're set up. You could have, just as a for instance, there was one person that I'm looking at that is a DRO of a member who received a 10% increase in their drop account when they were active drops. So there's all these different components, and they're receiving a cost of living adjustment, a cost of living annuity, surviving spouse annuity. There could be all these different components. So it really depends on the member that's randomly selected. I have spent, as Dave talked about, over 300 hours so far. I was expecting at least another 200 hours to finish this. So if we added, say, another 25, it's not going to double the time it's going to take, but it may increase it by 100, 150 hours if we doubled the population from 25 to 50, just on the wide random net.
Thanks, Bill. Got a handful of people in the queue here, including myself, and then Tanasi, Ed, and then Dick Wilkin again. And I think, Chris, if you want to move to the mic, I think maybe we've some oh, you have one there. Oh, sorry, I didn't see it there. I think we'll probably want to hear from you as well on this. But I had a couple of questions. Are we auditing benefit setups that have ever been audited before?
It's almost impossible for me to know that. There is some that management and staff has looked at in their categorical corrections department. So management has done a cleansing or a double look at some of these audit retirement benefit calculation setup. In our current IRIS system, there's a flag in there that says there's an audit flag for me to mark them that I have audited them in the past. There is no members currently that have that flag checked, as it's a new system, and I don't believe that this has ever been done in the past.
And I believe me, I embrace the importance of doing these audits because this is a system that our members demand perfection. The city, everybody demands perfection here, and it's a tough bar to meet. And so, with that said, one of the things you mentioned was more frequent auditing. I think maybe some of the problems we had because we didn't audit frequently enough. I mean, I'd ask your opinion on that. If we audited more, would we not have as many corrections as we have? Do you think we would have caught them more frequently? Of course, as an auditor, I think you'd probably say yes.
I would. I think anytime that you get a second set of eyes on something, you get that independent view of somebody that's not in the department looking at that activity. My belief is that you would catch errors or potential errors or anything that you may need a legal opinion on or some clarification on. I think those things would get caught a lot earlier and would lead to smaller corrections if there were any.
Correct, and that's kind of my point, because we either, at this juncture in our system, we're paying a lot of money in legal for corrections that have gone on for quite some time that maybe we would have caught through auditing, versus if we paid more money for auditing up front earlier, maybe we could spend less money on legal down the road. So it's kind of an investment. So I don't know, Elaine, do you have I see you nodding over there. Would you?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Had we done more rigorous auditing in the past, my thoughts are we probably would not have as many errors, or at least they wouldn't have gone on for as long a period of time and caused as much harm.
Right. So in regards to the auditing of our past benefit setups, I'm still struggling with that, because I do agree with Dick quite a bit on the difficulty that is. But I would really embrace much more rigorous auditing going forward, so that when these things are caught, the time frame isn't so high. So
that was one of the items that I actually specifically talked to Elaine about when this audit was first initially put on the audit plan. Is we talked about other systems, how they look at retirement benefit calculation setup on a yearly or biannual basis, or however they do it, but they routinely put this on their audit plan to look at the benefit calculation setup. So that is one thing that is on my radar, and if the board thinks that it's important enough for me to go look at every other year or every third year, however often the board thinks, I can certainly add that to my plan, or it can be yearly, however the board thinks.
all right, thank you, Lee. So I have Tanasi. Did you guys want to hear from Chris first, or move down the queue? How do you?
It's your call.
Chris, do you have any thoughts here?
Well, I'm having a deja vu moment because I was with another client board yesterday, and we were having almost exactly the same discussion. I think what SDCERS is doing with respect to auditing is clearly state of the art, and this discussion is great with respect to that aspect of it. I don't want you to forget about the comment that one of you made earlier in this discussion about quality control at the time of benefit setup, and are there ways to enhance that? Because when you divide the world into quality control and quality assurance, when you're at the audit stage, you're really at quality assurance. And in a perfect world, you're catching things prior, before you're even in the audit stage. And that's by no means to second guess existing processes, but the question I think you should be asking in tandem with, the rigorousness and frequency of your audits is what, if anything, can be done up front at the time of benefit setup with respect to quality control.
Very good, thank you.
Actually, can I jump in on that, because that does touch more to what our current systems are. When we converted from Pension Gold to IRIS over a year ago, we looked at all 8,000 retirement benefit setups that were in effect at that time under Pension Gold and replicated all of those calculations in IRIS before we went live. So that was a good assessment as to whether we were doing things consistently in Pension Gold with how they were being set up in IRIS. And that, of course, led to any number of the categorical corrections that Marcel has discussed in the past. Additionally, under the old Pension Gold environment, and even before then, there were some things that were not automated. They were done manually off to the side on spreadsheets, which makes it more ripe for a potential error. Now, under the IRIS, virtually everything we do is all programmed through IRIS. So you've got systemic controls in place to make sure that it's set up correctly in the IRIS system before you ever touch it. We're not doing off to the side type calculations. And regarding the quality assurance steps, while we do have things that are automated now, our quality assurance has bumped up considerably in IRIS from what it used to be. So we have a second set of eyes on many things that previously was not the case. That's even extended to the retiree health function, which never had the QA step that it does now. So prospectively, we're doing a lot of things right. But of course, the concern is, things that were done manually 15 years ago or 10 years ago, you might find errors. But then, if we have an active member now that comes in to retire, we notice something funny in their account, which was pertaining to something that was set up while they were active 10, 15 years ago, that may also affect people that have since retired.
Right.
So that opens up a can of concern there. So we don't want to get in a situation where by avoiding to do audits now or avoiding these old corrections, if we don't find them now until 5 years from now, it's going to make the problem that much bigger. So it's just essential that we be auditing these calculations that go back some time.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Tanasi?
Yeah, I think the issue is really one of what we're trying to accomplish in what you're doing. And I think the issue is we have a process by which we're going back and checking these old plans, and that's been a point of great concern and contention on this board for some time. And I don't think anybody wants to see it enhanced, that aspect, right? In other words, fine, we've got to do our job, we've got to go back and look and correct these things, and that's great. And, we agree or disagree with it, but I don't think anybody is talking about enhancing those efforts. And so I think the fear that some people are hearing is, hey, we're auditing these people, we're going back, we're doing the sampling, we're auditing the world, we're auditing everybody that's in the system. And the question becomes, wow, did we just enhance going after retirees who've been receiving pensions for 20 years that may have had a dollar error sometime back that now has an issue? I think all of us, I don't mean to speak for anybody else, appreciate and recognize the importance of making sure the benefit payments are correct on a going forward basis. Anybody who retires today, anybody who retires tomorrow, that their calculations are done correctly, consistently, and that there's no errors. And so I think what I'm hearing, and I think you're focused on the right places, we just want to make sure that what you're doing and the results of what are coming out of it are going to help the quality assurance on a going forward basis and are not being used as an additional step to go back and enhance collection efforts, which we already have a pending lawsuit on. And quite frankly, we ought to be probably holding the status quo until that issue is resolved rather than making it worse one way or the other. So that, I don't know if you have any comments to that. I love the discussion about audit samples and stuff. I don't care. The reality is, if you come in as the auditor and say we should do 25 or we should do 60 or whatever, God bless you. You knock yourself out on that stuff. That's why I didn't become an accountant. But the bigger issue really is, what's our goal? What are we doing with this information? And I want to be careful that we are not enhancing whatever our standard operating procedures are to go and collect off old retirees, which some of us, including me, don't like at all.
I completely understand. I did focus on what we are currently doing now. That's the reason I sat with every single member of our benefits administration system at length to talk about what they do, how they do it, what the quality assurance is over the retirement benefit calculation setup. But I would not be doing my job if I were to not inform you of something that I thought was done incorrectly that could affect members that have been paid in the past.
Ed?
Actually, a lot of what I was going to say has been covered now by Chris and Mark, but I think the conversation got a little confused along the way because Lee is really doing two things. One, he's gone back and he's looking, as he mentioned, at specific components. And Bill, to address your comment about the sample size, while intuitively 25 sounds small, 40, 60 sounds small, there are some very specific scientific sampling guidelines set up. So if it's done appropriately, those sample sizes are appropriate. So that the sample size I don't have a problem with. The main thing, in addition to going back, what Lee is doing is, what are we doing today? And this is what's been said. And we're looking at what are the controls that are set up in place. Are those controls appropriate? And if so, now are we following those controls, and are the people doing what they're supposed to be doing? And if the controls are appropriate, and if the people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, then we have assurance, at least going forward, that the benefit payments will be correct.
Dick?
I wanted to hear from others before I spoke again, and I appreciate the input of everybody that's spoken so far. I really like what Thanasi said, which is that we're not really looking to enhance or be more aggressive on a look-back basis, because that's just caused problems galore for the last couple of years and will if we continue to do that. And hope that your efforts can be focused on a going forward basis. I'd like us to get to a place where you feel that the QA process is tight enough that you can assure a retiree that if we haven't looked at your thing and found something wrong within, say, 3 years, you're good to go. We're not, you can rest assured that we're not going to find something in 5 or 10 or 15 years. Right now, I mean, I'm asked about retirees because of what's been going on in the last couple of years. Well, where do we stand? Am I going to be audited? Am I going to owe thousands of dollars? And that's just not acceptable. So appreciate what you're doing, and hopefully you can get us to that point where we feel on a going forward basis this problem will no longer be there.
Yeah, I think any further audit efforts in this area would be looking at the current benefit payment setups going forward, and not casting that wide net back. It wouldn't be appropriate, in my belief, not to cast that wide net on the onset, the first audit, but all the subsequent ones would just be on a go-forward basis.
Thank you, Lee. Okay, that clears the queue. So without anything else, there's a motion to approve staff's recommendation to approve the fiscal year 2016 internal audit plan. I have a mover of Ed.
Do we need a second, Elaine, since I'm on the committee?
We don't.
No.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion passed 11-0. All right, thank you. All right. Item number 2, moving down the agenda.
I'm going to go on now and describe the information items that came up at our audit committee meeting a couple days ago. Richard Green, the engagement partner on the audit of SDCERS for the fiscal year 2015 from Macias Genia and O'Connell, provided an overview of the fiscal year 2015 audit plan. He spoke about the significant and high-risk items, the general timeline for the audit, and future GASB pronouncements, and you'll hear more about that this morning, so I will not go into that. The timeline is expected to be similar to those in the past, resulting in a final report on December 9th of this year. Another information item was a presentation by David Bond, the SDCERS Chief Information Officer, on the security of the SDCERS information technology area. I believe it was Lee who suggested this report because of the global attention we're hearing about on cybersecurity. David described the multi-layered approach currently in place and the steps SDCERS has taken recently. The committee discussed the possibility of adding additional audit or assurance resources to validate the SDCERS current IT practices, as well as to test potential security weaknesses. Another information item that was presented was by Liza Krisafi, the Chief Investment Officer, describing the investment portfolio risk assessment that the investment division would be completing with the help of the consulting firm of Aon Hewitt. She pointed out that the purpose of this risk assessment was to address investment risk only and not operational risk, which is addressed in the SDCERS performance audit. Next, Elaine Reagan provided background on 3 staff recommendations for SDCERS policy changes, which will be action items for the Business and Governance Committee. They are revisions to the conflict of interest policy, to the policy for ethical conduct, compliance, and training, and to the fraud and criminal acts policy. Lee then presented the results of the external quality control of the SDCERS internal auditor. As you all know, we have one auditor who audits himself. This was the first external audit, which is recommended to be done every 5 years. It was performed by two internal auditors from other cities who've had a total of 65 years of combined experience. And really the question is, how well is the internal auditor monitoring and performing his own work, the processes, the work product? The review found that the SDCERS internal auditor's quality control system was providing reasonable assurance of conformance with audit standards. This is the highest level of conformance an internal audit function can achieve. We're very pleased with this good news on this first ever external quality assessment, which should be performed a minimum of every 5 years. so we're doing things right in an internal audit, as most of you can understand already. Then Lee presented his annual report, a required report that details the results of ongoing monitoring and other required disclosures under the Institute of Internal Auditors standards. He mentioned that his time required to complete the audits of the contributions and reporting of the 3 plan sponsors, the city, airport, and port, exceeded 1,300 hours. That's most of a year for him. His report also mentioned that over 90% of his audit recommendations were accepted by the internal audit areas that were audited. In addition, satisfaction surveys of those internal audit clients that he audited resulted in scores of 4.7 or better on a 5-point scale. He then provided the status on the fiscal year 2015 audit plan, the year that has just ended, reporting that 5 of the 7 planned audit activities were completed. 1 was in progress. 1 had yet to be started. He discussed the reasons which I've already presented to you, why he was able to complete only 5 out of 7, due to the unanticipated time to conduct the 3 plan sponsor audits and the time required for the SDCERS retirement benefit calculation setup. He also discussed the functionality of a computer software program that allows him to independently monitor activities that take place in the SDCERS Financial Department's accounting software. This allows him to dip in to accounting transactions by himself. His sampling of transactions in that department for the last 4 months has found them to be completely acceptable. So this is the internal auditor's opportunity to see what's going on a completely independent basis. The final information item was the Legal Services Compliance Report from Elaine, which will be summarized for you as part of the report from the Business and Governance Committee. At the end of the meeting, the Audit Committee held a closed session to discuss the annual performance review for the internal auditor. That concludes my report. The next Audit Committee's scheduled meeting is September 9 of this year.
Thank you, David. Any other board members, comments, questions? No?
Thank you.
Thank you. That took a little longer than you thought, huh, Lee? Is that seat warm? All right, next up on the agenda is Disability Committee. Committee met yesterday. All items were approved unanimously, so I will make the motion as the committee chair unless a fellow board member would like something pulled and voted on separately. Seeing none, I'll make the motion.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion passed 11-0. We also had the status report. Of note was the last fiscal year our applications were down, and we processed almost twice as many applications that came in, which was a good thing. We caught up, or getting caught up. The time of application to determination is right about a year now, so which is pretty good. We have a couple lingering due to hearings, but making good progress there. And then we had an influx of applications already. So that's it for disability. Business and Governance Committee.
Okay.
You can do that, Ed?
I'll give the report in Val's absence.
Val's absence, okay.
We had 7 action items that are on the consent agenda. I'm just going to take a couple of seconds to briefly describe each one because I think they're important and want to make sure if anybody has any questions that we pull them from the consent agenda and have a discussion. Items A1 through A3, and all of these items were passed unanimously by B&G. A1 through A3, the committee adopted staff's recommendation to revise the conflicts of interest policy, ethical conduct policy, and the fraud policy to include independent members of the audit and investment committees within the scope. Independent members will be required to file an annual Form 700. If the board adopts these recommendations, staff will work with the city attorney's office to add independent members of the committees to SDCERS Conflict of Interest Code. Item A4, the committee approved staff's recommendation to issue an RFP for investment counsel. A5, committee approved staff's recommendation to adopt the revised education policy adding a requirement that trustees meet with the general counsel to develop a training plan which will be approved by the board annually. Trustees also will have the flexibility to request additional training throughout the year if needed. Item A6, the committee approves staff's recommendation to maintain the status quo pertaining to the collection of overpayments and underpayments because of the uncertain nature of any alternative at this point. And item A7, the committee approves staff's recommendation to execute a new 3-year Microsoft licensing agreement for a cost not to exceed $80,000. Does any trustee wish to pull any items for discussion? Seeing none, I will make a motion to approve the consent items. No second is needed.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
Motion passed 11-0. Okay, then we had a number of non-action items. Item B1, the committee reviewed the fiduciary council policy, information technology policy, and outside counsel consultant opinions policy, and at this point does not recommend any changes to these policies. Under old business, action requested, the committee unanimously adopted staff's recommendation for proposals to the City Charter Review Committee to add language to the City Charter, Section 141.2, empowering the City Council to adopt an ordinance allowing the city to pay all or some of an overpayment or underpayment and associated interest. We ask that Section 144 be clarified to provide that an attorney can be appointed to the board with 15 years of combined experience in pension administration, actuarial practice, investment management, real estate banking, or accounting, which are the requirements for the independent members of this board. And also to add a provision allowing employees and retirees of the airport and the port to run for the elected seats on the board. And Dick Wilkin congratulated staff for a job well done. And with that, I will make a recommendation to adopt staff's recommendation for these proposals.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And motion passes 11-0. Under old business, no action requested. Item C2, one additional member owing more than $10,000 was reported to the board. This is on the overpayments and underpayments reporting. 2 members previously reported to the board have resolved their overpayments via a lump sum and a payment plan. One paid in full and one has a payment plan. Dave Bond then gave us some preliminary cost estimates for updating our audio and video systems to high definition. The cost estimates were between $120,000 and $180,000. The current big screen projector is fading and needs to be replaced. Direction was given to staff to proceed with the necessary big screen projector upgrade, and the committee directed staff to issue an RFP for the remainder of the HD work and bring back to the committee for further discussion once we receive responses to the RFP. We then had the staff reports by division. Legal, Elaine reported that the domestic relations module for IRIS went live on June 15th and thanked each of our staff for their excellent work on this project. Elaine identified 4 tax compliance projects she's working on in relation to payment of DROs, obtaining a private letter ruling from the IRS on the taxable nature of certain components of industrial disability requirements, tax withholding, and review of trust documents where a trust is designated as the beneficiary. Dave Bond then gave the information technology report. He reported that IRIS has been live for 1 year as of May 29th. Happy anniversary. Sagitech remains contractually obligated to fix all software defects reported before May 29th free of charge. Our voice and data network vendor, Xerox, ran an automated security penetration test on our network, systems and devices, and vulnerabilities have been corrected through configuration changes and software updates. And then Dave announced that Ray Lawler will be replacing Blanca Gomez, supporting the boardroom systems. Blanca's moving on to Texas. And Ray, if you could stand up so we can welcome you.
Welcome, Ray.
Thank you.
Almost there. Member services. Cynthia did a very nice thing. Cynthia introduced 4 members of the call center team, as well as Supervisor Antonio Roberti, and the B&G committee congratulated them for their outstanding performance in June, achieving a record low call wait time average of 13 seconds during the very busy health open enrollment month. I think it was Alan that made the observation that members of Cynthia's team are a lot younger than members of sitting here at the dais, so whatever that's worth.
Yeah. I typically make those remarks, but I think that was actually Val.
Was that Val?
Okay, how many times do you have to hang up on somebody to get the 13 seconds?
No, we don't do that. Mayor Alomar reported on the excellent work by the health team during open enrollment, particularly at the popular Open Enrollment Help Day in Balboa Park, where 4 staff members assisted 400 members in 2 hours. Benefits Administration, Marcy Kat, it was announced that Marcy Takis retired, and the open position will not be refilled. This was anticipated and planned for through efficiencies gained through IRIS. And then last, Ted gave a report on that finance is current with the financial reporting through May 2015 and has completed a major upgrade of the Microsoft Dynamics accounting system. Congratulations to Ted and the entire staff. We were awarded by the General Finance Officers Association the Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting for our June 30th CAFR. That's the highest. That's a real achievement. It's the highest rating that you can get. And then Ted also reported on the May 2015 financial statements. As of May 31st, SDCERS has a net position of $6.8 billion and total investments of $6.8 billion, which are an increase of $210 million and $288 million respectively from the prior year. For the 11 months ended May 31st, SDCERS had an increase in net position of $64 million, smaller growth than last year due to the lower investment returns. And that's my report. Sorry it's so lengthy.
I've covered a lot of ground. So, next on the agenda is Investment Committee. Bill?
The Investment Committee met yesterday. We reviewed 2 action item requests. One was the recommendation to adopt proposed asset allocation. There was no change to that, and we unanimously approved bringing it to the board for approval. And then we reviewed the recommendation on proposed manager structure, and there was no change to that. And we unanimously approved that to come to the board for approval. We looked at the review of securities lending program, and that since 2014 has returned back to us about $28 million, which is a pretty nice program in terms of the return to the SDCERS. We looked at the capital markets assumptions, and basically things are slowing down a little bit, so I think it's something we need to just keep our eye on where the returns are, because we've got a actuarial return of 7.25 and it's looking like it's less. And that's pretty much it.
Should we vote on the 2 action items?
Yes, let's take a vote on action.
There was a couple action items there, so we'll need a motion up.
Okay,
Liza
I'd move
is here to
that
go
we,
through some of this stuff with the board. so-
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's important to actually go through the capital markets assumptions and the asset allocation, because the asset allocation drives 80 to 90% of our returns. So it's an important investment item to consider. But I'd like to start with the capital markets assumptions and walk through that so you understand what the new expected return on the portfolio is and how we got there. So if you turn to slide 3, the capital markets assumptions overview, basically what are they? They're forward-looking forecasts that are prepared by Aon Hewitt, and they look at a 30-year, a long-term expected return for the various asset classes. Some of the key points to keep in mind are that they are assuming market returns, so returns from indexes basically, with no active management premium added in there. Their volatility assumptions are based on current volatility levels in the market, as well as looking at some historical data. And then their correlation assumptions are based on historic information. If you turn to slide number 6, this gives you the asset class expected risk and return. And as you can see towards the left-hand side of the slide, you have your 2015 expectations. In the middle is from a year ago, the 2014 expectations, and then July of 2010, which is a little after we first hired Aon Hewitt. And the thing to note on this page really is that the returns for every asset class are lower than they were in 2014 and lower than they were in 2010, with the exception of emerging market equities and real estate. The significant drivers of these lower returns come from the fact that over the past 5 years, we've had outsized returns in the equity market. The other thing you'll notice is that the returns on U.S. intermediate fixed income have come down significantly. In fact, from 2014, they're down almost 32%. And again, this is a function of the lower interest rate environment. And as we've talked before, we do expect interest rates to go up at some point. And if you think of fixed income returns with bond prices and bond yields go up, bond prices go down, that's a negative. So those are the driving factors of the lower returns. One thing I did want to turn to Mark to make a few comments about this is that Chiron will be coming in September to talk about the discount rate, and they are going to provide some additional information for you all to look at.
Yes, it's tempting to want to engage right now on what does this mean from an actuarial point of view, and that'll be discussed at length in September. As you know, we look at our economic actuarial assumptions every year in the September timeframe. So Chiron's been provided a copy of the HEK materials that you see here today. They'll be prepared to talk about not only what HEK is seeing in terms of long-term capital market assumptions, but what are several other financial houses doing, what are other pension systems across the country doing. He'll be able to talk about how investment returns are impacting the system, as well as anticipated actuarial assumption changes that we may be looking at next year. So a lot of good stuff to cover in September. So today, just pay attention to what the investment house is doing, and we'll get to the actuarial stuff in a few months.
Did you just say ignore the man behind the curtain?
Yeah.
Then turning to slide 8.
May I ask a quick question? I
sure.
think it was on slide 6, the one where you showed. Yes. I understand you were talking about the last 5 years, and that's what's driven the rates lower. What I'm a little surprised about, though, is between 2010 and 2014, the rates actually didn't go much lower. In fact, in some cases, they went higher, and that's 4/5 of the last 5 years, obviously. And then all of a sudden, this last year, you see the significant drop. Based on what you said, I would have expected that 2014 to have been lower than it is.
Okay.
I mean, I guess maybe I'm a little disappointed in Aon Hewitt that they didn't pick up on this a little sooner than they are.
Oh, with a trend towards the expected returns coming
Yeah,
down.
it just seems to me I would have seen more of a drop between 2010 and 2014, and 2014 to 2015, a more moderate drop, because 14 was expected to be lower.
But didn't we have really high returns in 14? I mean, wasn't that, I mean, so, I mean, I'm not sure how he would have, I mean, because you're modeling and smoothing this stuff out. I mean, if 14 is a spike year, I'm not sure that you would have seen that come down. And am I?
No, I think that's correct. That just added, because we did have a very strong year in 2014. That added to the fact that the expected returns are going to be lower. But really, I think to me the biggest driver here is what's happening with fixed income. That's a big drop, even in 1 year. Now, they do update these quarterly, so we're only seeing this year to year. So over the last 4 quarters, I'm sure these rates have been coming down. We're just looking at it year over year. And then I'm actually going to get to another chart that kind of talks about where we've been and why we are where we are right now.
Okay.
So if you'll turn to slide 8, this shows what those returns mean for our portfolio and our weightings. And if you look in the middle, there's the long-term policy, the current long-term asset allocation, versus the long-term allocation for 2014. And if you go to the bottom, you can see the expected return on the portfolio is 6.58 versus a year ago at 7.36. The real return net of inflation is 4.38. The standard deviation, or the measure of risk, has actually come down a little, which is good. And your Sharpe ratio, which measures how much reward you're getting for the amount of risk you're taking, actually has gone up. And again, that's another good thing. The higher the Sharpe ratio, the better. A couple things I want to point out on this page is, one, again, keep in mind, this is a snapshot of 1 point in time. So this is their expected returns currently. If we go through a period where we do have some subpar returns, and this year's going to be one of them, these expected returns could go back up. This is not fixed. These move based on what's happening in the market. The other thing is, I'm going to talk a little bit more about when we get to the asset allocation. What are we doing in light of this lower expected return environment? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But before I do that, I want to show you one other chart that we prepared internally, which shows you our returns over the last 5 years for the fiscal year ending 2014 versus our expected returns on the portfolio. And you can see the shaded areas, those 2 big mountains in there, that's excess return over what we expected. And so over the last 5 years, you've had a return on the portfolio of 13.5% versus a 10-year average of 7.8%. That's almost double. And so essentially what we've done is we've borrowed return in the last 5 years from going forward. So that this is largely responsible for why we're seeing expected lower returns now. We've had a great 5-year environment. Any additional questions?
You're tempting us to get into that discussion, those types of...
Actually, Liza, if you go back to the slide before that on their report, one thing we talked about, I asked if this was more of a conservative report, and we kind of identified that they have their expectations for the inflation pretty low.
Yeah.
And they don't expect it. Well, they remained at a lower inflation rate, which we'll probably see that go up.
Well, Aon Hewitt, generally speaking, has very conservative estimates. Their inflation assumption is about 2.2%. If you talk to Chiron, their inflation rate is closer to 3%. So if you take that real return of 4.38, technically you added 3%, well, you're back over 7. Again, Aon Hewitt tends to be very conservative. So this is, from their perspective, you have to look at everything.
Thank you. Thank you, Liza. Carol, you're in the queue.
Another issue that came up that we talked about is that the consultants' assumptions are very sort of standardized for plans across the board, and in particular for private equity and infrastructure. They had a very conservative number that really isn't reflective of what we're doing in our actual program. We have higher benchmarks, and we've had success at meeting those benchmarks. So there's a case for developing more of a customized scenario around this number of, say, 6.58 to really reflect what we're doing in those asset classes.
And I've actually tasked them to come back to us with something that's a little more customized to our portfolio. One of the things they may be looking at is what kind of excess return have we experienced from active management? Because this is all based basically on passive management. What kind of excess returns or what kind of premium have we earned based on active management? So what have we experienced above these market benchmarks? And they're going to come back to us with something that's a little more customized to our portfolio.
All right, thank you. Very good discussion on capital market assumptions. So, Jimmy,
Okay.
you have another. Do we want to go back up the agenda to?
Yeah, then we
action
want to talk
items?
about
Okay.
asset allocation, which we
There we
need
go.
to vote on, and then followed by manager structure.
Okay.
So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but asset allocation obviously is a very important topic. It drives, as I said, 80 to 90% of your return. This is something we do annually. It's very important that we look at the appropriate mix of return-seeking assets versus risk-mitigating assets. And in light of the lower capital markets assumptions, we do expect that we're going to have a more challenging market environment. But there are some things that I want to talk about that we're doing in the portfolio to try and mitigate some of that. So if you turn to slide number 6, this just outlines some of the things that we look at when we go through this process. We look at long-term expected returns, diversification, inflation, all those different things. And keep in mind that since we've hired Aon Hewitt, which was back in May of 2010, we have made some significant changes to the asset allocation, which we feel better position the portfolio going forward. And I'd like to get into some of those in detail on slide 7. This gives you a summary of some of the changes we've made in public equities. We've streamlined the portfolio to be more in line with the global opportunity set. Previously, we were more heavily weighted in U.S. stocks. We still have a little bit of a U.S. bias, but it's a much more even mix. We've added a 5% global equity component and a 1% emerging market equity component. In return-seeking fixed income, which is really emerging market debt, we added that as an allocation a few years back at a 3% allocation, and we moved that to 5%. The role of that in the portfolio is really twofold. It's to provide better diversification and has the potential for higher yields than what we were seeing in both U.S. fixed income and international fixed income. In alternatives, we're really talking about private equity, infrastructure, and real estate, which are areas of strength for us. We increased the target on private equity from 5% to 10%. We're building out that allocation. We're currently at about 7.5%. We added a 3% target to infrastructure. We're currently at about 1.5% there. And we've maintained our real estate allocation. And there we're really focusing on improving some of our manager selection. And then in the Opportunity Fund, we created this bucket where we could look at opportunistic strategies. And we have committed to four different investments. We've put in some opportunistic real estate strategies. And just to give you an idea of the return profile for those strategies, that's closer to about 15% net of fees. And then we've also committed to an opportunistic debt strategy whose return expectation, again, over a market cycle is probably somewhere in the low teens. So we're really focusing on some of these areas in the portfolio that are higher generating return strategies, especially in the alternatives section. And then in the risk-reducing area, in U.S. fixed income, which is the anchor to the portfolio, we've maintained that, but we've shortened the duration, which makes it much more conservative. If you're in a rising interest rate environment, you want to be in shorter duration maturities, which will be impacted less in that kind of environment. And then we're going to talk a little bit when we get to manager structure about what we've done with PIMCO and restructuring that allocation. And then slide 8 just shows you the progress we've made towards the long-term asset allocation. And you can see we're still a little overweight in U.S. equity and non-U.S. equity because we're continuing to build out private equity, infrastructure, and the Opportunity Fund. And those, especially the Opportunity Fund, is funded out of U.S. and non-U.S. equities and a little bit out of fixed income. And the recommendation basically is to make no changes at this point. We are still continuing to look for interesting opportunities for the Opportunity Fund, and we'll bring those forward as we come across them. We think the portfolio's accurately positioned. We've had an enhanced diversification, greater risk-reward trade-offs. We've added a sizable amount of passive to the portfolio over the last few years. And basically the only thing that we will be looking at is in September when we review the investment policy statement. We need to make a few tweaks there because we did agree to combine the private equity and infrastructure allocations into a single allocation, basically for back office and streamlining operations, although the consultants will still report out both of those allocations separately and in great detail for everyone. So we'll be updating that in September, but the recommendation is to make no changes at this time.
Bill?
So I'd like to make a motion that we approve this asset allocation motion.
Carol was a little quick on the trigger finger there.
Oh, I'm sorry. He's supposed to do it?
Yeah, there we go.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion passed 11-0. Number 2?
And then Anders is going to quickly cover manager structure,
Okay.
which you also have to vote on.
All right. So as Eliza mentioned, the strategic asset allocation, implementing this strategic asset allocation is in an efficient manner is key to achieving the goals and objectives that we have in the SDCERS investment program. So there are a number of core beliefs that we have in the investment program at SDCERS. First is to gain exposure to broad asset classes through low-cost index funds, and that kind of leads back to paying little for beta, which is the next one. And what do I mean by paying little for beta? That basically means that we don't want to pay excessive fees to an active manager in very efficient asset classes such as large U.S. companies, so that then we gain access through that through low-cost index providers as well, and focus more of the alpha. And that's the kind of where you have the ability to get excess returns in less efficient places like small cap, domestic equities, emerging market equities, and so forth. And the third tenet is to eliminate style box and focus more on kind of skill. So when I say style box, that's so you think about large, mid, and small cap stocks, and then you have growth, value, and blend. So that creates 9 boxes, right? So some people think of it, well, we got to find a large cap value manager, we got to find a small cap value manager, even though they don't really need that. So we're trying to focus instead on building the most efficient portfolio instead of checking off all the boxes to fill in the style box universe. And so then that goes to the fourth tenet, which is to focus more on skill than on style, and allowing managers to have a broad latitude in terms of where they can find well-priced assets. And that kind of goes to the global equities asset sleeve that we built out, so saying that instead of you focus on U.S. equities, you focus on international. You have a manager with a broad skill set that can find opportunities across the world, basically. And the fifth tenet would be to utilize an active risk budgeting to kind of focus the risk on those areas that are less efficient, where there's opportunity to gain excess return instead of just gaining market return and paying a lot for it. And the last one also kind of goes with that theme, to keep the fees lower. So with that said, you can see kind of a history of where we have been in terms of the passively managed portion of the portfolio, and where we kind of we are right now, and then you can compare that to other public funds. You can see that pre the restructuring in 2010, I believe it was, we only had 10% in passively managed market portfolios in the public markets section. And then in 2012 we were at 48, and in 15 we were at 62. So we've taken quite a bit of actively managed broad market exposure and put it into low-cost index providers. Same thing with fixed income. We had no low-cost index providers in pre-restructure, and we went to 25 and 12 and 40% in March of this year. So you can see the results of this. Annual savings since we implemented this has been over approximately $8 million on an annual basis, by just making sure that we're paying little for beta. And with that high-level view, staff and consultant has no recommendations to any changes in the manager structure. Liza's going to cover PIMCO a little bit more in depth.
Sure. One of the things that we talked about yesterday was the allocation to PIMCO. And as you know, a while back, Bill Gross left the firm, and we cut our allocation in half. Ann Hewitt has continued to monitor the firm and has raised their rating from a hold back to a buy. And we had a discussion, staff and the consultant, should we give more money back to PIMCO? And the result of that discussion was that we didn't feel that we should. And the reason being is cutting back that allocation to PIMCO did a couple things in the portfolio. It reduced the active risk in the fixed income portion of the portfolio from 1.4 to 0.8%. We believe that's a prudent move to make in that portion of the portfolio that's supposed to be very conservative and the anchor for the portfolio. It also reduced the risk of PIMCO, because prior to reducing that weighting, PIMCO accounted for 70% of the risk in the fixed income portfolio. Cutting them back, it's now even between PIMCO and the other manager, Matt West, which we also feel is a more prudent risk posture, because prior to that, when PIMCO was 70% of the weighting, if PIMCO makes a wrong call, that has a big impact on the fixed income portfolio. So we think it's appropriate to have both of those managers more evenly weighted. So just wanted to let you know that.
Thank you. Bill?
I just make one comment before I make the motion, and that is that if you look at the mix of our portfolio, it's been 78-22 roughly between equities or return-seeking assets and fixed income. And it was that 5 or 6 years ago. It's that today, and it's that proposed going forward. So we're not really making any changes to that mix. But the mix within the 78% has changed dramatically in the last 5-6 years. So what we've done is we've gone from public equities, which were the large amount of that in the past, to half of it now is in higher risk-seeking, what I call higher risk-seeking returns, private equity, infrastructure, real estate, all those other categories. Okay, so we've now shifted to half of that, and we're trying to basically go after a higher return to get to the 7.25 in a way. I mean, you can look at it that way. So I believe that overall we have to keep our eye on this. Things can happen globally and in the emerging markets and in the real estate markets, as we've seen in the past, much more quickly to change the returns than in the public equities, which we're largely passive now, and we're going to be market returns on those. Even though we're expecting higher returns on that new 35% we put in. So I just wanted to point that out. From a big picture point of view, that's how I've seen it in the 4 years here, the shifts we're making. And I think it's a good thing for us, and our peers are doing it for sure, but it does add another element to the return that we have to look at.
And one thing I'd just like to add, next March, we're going to be conducting an asset liability study. And that basically goes and looks back at the 78-22 mix and says, is that really appropriate, or do we need to make a change there? So we'll be doing that in March.
I had a quick question on one of Bill's comments about the private equity and the return-seeking nature objective. It was my understanding also that was to address some of the correlation concerns as well going into private equity.
Yeah, that provides a nice diversification compared to U.S. equities or fixed income.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. So I'd like to make a motion that we approve the recommendation on proposed manager structure.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion passed 11-0. Did we cover everything? Next page. Annual review of securities litigation.
Well, before we get to that, we actually had securities lending.
Oh, securities lending. There we
Sounds
go.
like
We kind of bounced around a little bit there. Yes.
Just very quickly, we had our annual review of our securities lending program. 2 individuals came in from State Street. We've been involved in this program for 17 years. We have 9 active portfolios enrolled in the program. Since inception, we've earned $28 million. Year to date, we've added $455,000. And really, the purpose of being involved in securities lending is, one, to generate additional incremental return, and it also really helps save on our custodial fees. Because if you also engage in securities lending with your custodian, it can reduce your custodial fees by anywhere from 50% to more than that. Any questions?
No. Thanks, Liza.
And then Johnny gave a brief presentation on our securities litigation activity. This, again, is an annual review that he provides. And basically the highlights were that we recovered approximately $1.4 million in the last fiscal year. And then he put together a nice summary of the cases that we're currently participating in, as well as the policy. And if you have any questions, you can ask Johnny.
He's way in the back there, so. There's nobody in the queue, so thank you. Status reports?
All right. The reconciled market value as of May 31st was $6,863,000,000, and since the prior board meeting, we paid out 6 wires totaling about $8.6 million to pay for payroll and operating expenses. We also sent out 2 wires totaling $66 million to pay for monthly member benefits, and that's about it.
Nobody in the queue. Thank you, Anders. All right. Next on the agenda, training.
Thank you. I think Mark had some preliminary comments before we start. Did you want to talk about the...
We can queue all the items up individually, and I'll jump in. Yep.
So first on the list is Dick Wilkin has requested authorization to attend the Nossaman Public Pension and Investment Fiduciary Forum September 24 to 25 in San Francisco. That's formerly the Manat Fiduciary Forum. I've attended that twice. It is very good. They go over some very good issues. So is anyone else interested in attending that particular seminar? we'll need a motion and a second.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that passed 11-0.
With a motion by Ed and a second by James Steele. Before I move on to the next item, on that first page, we also have the Wharton School investment strategies and the Pepperdine Calipers Principles of Pension Management. Those are both excellent conferences. Anyone who's not attended, this would in essence be your, or who has not already received approval and would like to attend, this would be your last opportunity to get that authorization.
Ed is actually a panelist at the Calipers item.
When is the Pepperdine one?
August 25th to the 28th.
Yeah, actually, I would like to be added to that.
Okay, so if you could get a motion up from James Steele.
A long one.
Okay, there's a motion up to approve James Steele to attend Principles of Pension Management for Trustees at Pepperdine in August. I have a mover of Dick Wilkin, a second of Bill Hayner.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion passes 11-0.
The next request we have was with regards to the IFEBP conference in November. And at the last board meeting, I'll let Mark.
Sure.
Yeah,
The IFEBP conference this year is in Hawaii. We discussed at the last board meeting that this year the conference is in Hawaii, and it had not been on the calendar before, and part of that is because in past board discussions there was some headline risk associated with sending trustees to locations like Hawaii, and at the May meeting what you all discussed was it's probably okay if we have a representative or two go, but not a lot of board members go. That would probably be the prudent thing to do. So Cynthia did inquire, attempted to get a couple seats there prior to us voting on this thing today. She was able to secure one reservation, but the conference is actually booked at this point. So we have openings for one, which I think we've got
I think Mr. Hayner had requested.
Mr. Hayner going on that one. So that's the status of that conference.
Thank you. Do we need a...
Can I just make a comment, just for the record?
Yeah.
I think, so the record's clear, we have gone to the IFEB conference in past years. Many of us have. It's a very valuable conference. The cost to go to Hawaii is no greater than to go to some of the other venues we've had. So although, as Mark said, there's a certain headline risk, I think it's a prudent discussion. I mean, I think it's a prudent action for people to attend at a conference, regardless of the venue, just because there's great value to it.
I'd agree. I think going to Boston last year may have been more expensive than going to Hawaii in the upcoming year. So it's just the Hawaii risk is really what we're addressing. We already approved Bill to go.
We have not.
We have not. Okay, so we'll need a motion up to approve that. All right, there's a motion to approve Bill Hayner to attend IFEBP 61st Annual Employee Benefits Conference in November. Mover of James Steele, second of Ed Katroser.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion passed 11-0.
Okay, so are there any others?
I had requested to go to the Hawaii one as well, but after Mark's remarks, do I need to be on a waiting list, like if there's cancellation within this group?
That's a possibility. We would need to put you on the list and have the board vote again and put you on a waiting list, and we could see if you clear.
So you want to wait for that on a future date or do it now?
I think the appropriate thing to do would be to motion for that now so that we get you in a waiting list now. If we wait later, you may never clear it.
Right. I think board approval now, so if it clears tomorrow, we can add them tomorrow. Yes. Be careful going out the door, Bill. All right, so we'll need another motion up, Cynthia, to approve Jeff Wallace. All right, so there's a motion up to approve Jeff Wallace to attend the same conference as Bill in Hawaii on November 8th through 11th. I'll make the motion. Seconded, James Steele.
Ready to vote. All votes are in.
And Jeff is passed 11-0 as the backup plan. So, all right. Anything else? No?
No.
Okay. That's it. Questions and comments from anybody?
We do have closed session.
And we have closed session. So I had one comment on our non-agenda speaker on the Brown formula. I know I get a lot of questions as an elected on that formula, and I don't know if the other electeds do, but is there a way we can provide some type of briefing to the board, maybe not through a board meeting, but some type of informational briefing to us so we can understand the formula, how it works in the...
Certainly.
Okay, thank you. All right, anything from any other board members? No? Let's take a break, and then we will go into closed session at 10:15. Okay, coming out of closed session, the only item we have to report is the board approved the retaining of Dave Noonan for item 11 on the closed session docket. And with that, we are adjourned.